Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, let's talk about the fact that Tulsi Gabbard, Democrat Congresswoman from Hawaii, has filed suit against Google, alleging that it prevented her from buying Google ads in the immediate aftermath of the first Democrat presidential debate, when Gabbard's name and her performance were trending heavily on the internet. She's suing Google for $50 million, contending that she was prevented from buying ads for political reasons. Fortune magazine reports that a Google spokesperson denied that the suspension of Tulsi Gabbard's account after the debate was deliberate, and instead advised that her account was flagged by an automated system designed to detect fraudulent activity like major changes in spending. The Gabbard campaign also alleges in the suit that Google has tweaked the algorithms it uses for Gmail in such a way that they've caused her campaign communications to go to the spam folders of recipients. As Fortune notes, it's unusual for a Democrat to make such claims. For the most part, those claims of censorship by big tech, including manipulation of algorithms, have come from the right, especially conservative commentators on the internet. But Ms. Gabbard may have a point. As I've said before, the power of big tech is terrifying. Notwithstanding all of our national hand-wringing over the last 2.5 years about purported attempts by Russia to influence the results of our presidential election, Google has far more ability to influence elections in America and elsewhere. Think about what has been shown over the last couple of years when Google search queries for phrases like Hillary indictment wouldn't autocomplete when similar negative searches on the Republican side would autocomplete. Now think about expanding the volume of those instances to tens of millions and even hundreds of millions of political queries entered into Google. The potential impact of tweaks to their algorithm just on the autocomplete issue without even taking into account whether search results might be manipulated so that certain candidate references or certain sites which are more favorable to particular candidates, political parties, or philosophies are displayed first. The potential for Google's algorithm to impact the results of elections is terrifying. How terrifying? Well, last week, Dr. Robert Epstein, Harvard-educated PhD in psychology and behavioral sciences, testified before the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution. It's worth noting that Dr. Epstein is a Democrat who notes that he voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Epstein conducted a study based on 13,000 saved search results and controlled experiments regarding the search engine manipulation effect, or SEME, which Google's algorithm produces. His conclusion? That the manipulation by the search algorithm used by Google, quote, likely impacted undecided voters in a way that gave at least 2.6 million votes to Hillary Clinton in 2016. That's shocking. It represents nearly her entire popular vote margin of 2.8 million. And keep in mind, he said, at least. His study shows that elimination of the Google algorithm alone might have resulted in a popular vote victory by Donald Trump. On July 27 in AmericanGreatness.com, author Ned Ryan, in an article entitled Google's Algorithms Threaten Free and Fair Election, goes further into the explanation provided by Dr. Epstein. Quote, SEME is one of the most powerful forms of influence ever discovered in the behavioral sciences, and it is especially dangerous because it is invisible to people, subliminal in effect. It leaves people thinking they've made up their own minds, which is very much an illusion. It also leaves no paper trail for authorities to trace. Worse still, the very few people who can detect bias in search results shift even farther in the direction of the bias. So merely being able to see the bias doesn't protect you from it. Bottom line, biased search results can easily produce shifts in the opinions and voting preferences of undecided voters by 20% or more, up to 80% in some demographic groups. Close quote. As mind-blowing as all of that is, consider this. Epstein believes that, quote, Google has likely been determining the outcomes of upwards of 25% of the national elections worldwide since at least 2015. Close quote. This can't be allowed to continue. So what is the bias in the algorithms? In what direction does it lean? Well, a Google engineer named Greg Coppola, who should have at least some understanding of how the algorithm works, recently went to Project Veritas to tell them that based on his 5 years of experience at Google and his PhD, he understands algorithms. He explained that you can use machine learning to get the results that you want. Coppola advised that he's effectively seen, quote, big tech and the big media merge basically with the Democrat Party, close quote. As Coppola explained, the Democrat Party and media message that supporters of Donald Trump are racist has colored reviews of the left-leaning employees of Google that prepare the algorithms. He says he, quote, looks at search, referring to the Google search function, and Google News, close quote, and he sees the impact. He described Google News as just a news aggregator, and the bias of Google News as being so extreme that he considers it, quote, interference in the American election, close quote. But isn't that phrasing a bit extreme? Well, if it were an independent news site, yes. That would be like saying that MSNBC is interfering in the American election because it's so pro-Democrat Party and so far left. Or, for that matter, like saying that Fox News is interfering in the American election because its opinion segment, all the shows which appear in prime time, are so pro-Trump or pro-Republican Party. That's not interference in an election. That's political news and commentary. But if all you're doing is aggregating, and you pretend you're doing so in an unbiased manner, that's an interesting question. If you manipulate search results, on the other hand, that's not just an interesting question. To my mind, that is absolutely interfering in an American election. And in that respect, Google has far too much power. The regulators need to step up, investigate, and get to the bottom of the Google algorithms, how they're being used, and whether they are in fact being used to interfere in American elections. And if they are, it needs to be stopped. Next topic. Is change coming to the land of 10,000 lakes? Minnesota has always been thought of as a Democratic territory, a clearly blue state. Even in the Reagan landslide of 1984, Minnesota went for the Democrat. It was the only state, plus the District of Columbia, that the Democratic nominee, Walter Mondale, would win that year. Of course, the fact that Mondale was from Minnesota surely helped. But Donald Trump did surprisingly well in Minnesota in 2016. He only fell 1.5% short of Hillary Clinton in the North Star State. In the private conversations that I've had over the last several months regarding the election, where I've continued to express my conclusion that President Trump will in fact be reelected, as I've said before, provided we don't go into a recession, I've mentioned that I think he has a good chance of expanding on his electoral college margin. I tend to get pushback on that claim, but the first two states I go to in explaining the ones that I think he could add to his tally from 2016 are, first, New Hampshire, where Trump was only 0.4% behind Hillary in the final tally, and then second, Minnesota. In the July 24, 2019 edition of The Federalist, Stuart Lawrence pens an article entitled, "Once a Democratic Bastion, Minnesota Trends Red Heading into 2020." The author makes the point that President Trump might have won Minnesota in 2016 if he made it more of a priority. He noted that Trump didn't visit the state for any rallies until late in the campaign, a decision which Trump later regretted, stating that, quote, "one more big rally and we would have won," close quote. President Trump isn't likely to make that mistake again. As the article points out, he's held 3 rallies in Minnesota since October of last year alone, and he's also taken to Twitter during the Pledge of Allegiance flap in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, to express his support for the pledge and opposition to the local proposal to abandon it. And don't forget that one of his favorite targets, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, is from Minnesota. Regardless of whether she's popular in her district, I seriously doubt that her support for boycotting Israel, requests for leniency for Minnesota men accused of trying to join ISIS, and opposition to efforts to support a replacement for Venezuelan strongman Nicolas Maduro sit well with much of the rest of the state. That's all the more reason for Trump to pick a fight with the Squad, of which Ilhan Omar is the second most prominent member, as I've talked about in the last 2 episodes. 2 more reasons to believe that Trump is well positioned for a Minnesota win. The unemployment rate in Minnesota is only 3.3%. Also, as the article points out, Trump has moved to expand nickel and copper mining in the state, which is the opposite of the approach taken by President Obama, who refused to renew mining leases in his final weeks in office. Environmental groups weren't happy with Trump's decision, but polling has shown Minnesotans support it, especially in the counties surrounding the project in question. I'll be watching Minnesota closely as we get closer to the election, and I'll keep you advised regarding what I find. Next topic. '81 and counting. I've been a political news junkie for as long as I can remember, and one of the things that constantly frustrates me is that when you consume so much political news over time, it's very easy to forget some of the stories, even ones that were eye-opening at the time. It's even easier to forget the stories that you read that were significant but not terribly eye-opening, but later turned out to be absolutely false. If you forget exactly what you read, and what you read later turns out to be false, could you be remembering pieces of the prior story as if they're true when in fact they're not? Because you can't remember the whole story and you aren't linking it up with the story you may or may not have seen later, disproving it. That's one of the reasons when I'm on Twitter and I find somebody posting a tweet from long ago, or a link to a news article from long ago with a comment like, quote, "this didn't age well," close quote, I appreciate it, and I often respond with a thank you for preventing the tweet or the story from, quote, "going down the memory hole," close quote. So when I saw an article by one of my favorite journalists, Cheryl Atkinson, entitled 81 Media Mistakes in the Trump Era, the Definitive List, I was delighted. For those of you who aren't familiar with Cheryl Atkinson, she's the journalist who resigned from CBS in 2014 because she was fed up with the network's liberal bias. Because the list was coming from Atkinson, I could have confidence it was accurate, and because it was such a large number, I had no doubt she would pick up on items I'd forgotten. We should all keep our heads wrapped around the scale of the misinformation coming from the media, especially regarding the Trump administration. Therefore, I urge you to read the entire list at CherylAtkinson.com. Until then, though, I'll give you a flavor with a few of the items from the list. The New York Times and multiple other media sources suggested or implied that Donald Trump didn't pay his taxes for 18 years. You may now remember that when actual pages from one of his tax returns did leak to MSNBC, Rachel Maddow famously engaged in extensive, breathless, over-the-top promotion of the big reveal to come, only to reveal taxes paid at a higher rate than that paid by Bernie Sanders and President Obama. Do you remember the false story that President Trump had the Martin Luther King bust removed from the Oval Office? If prompted, I'd remember it, but not without prompting. What about the media claiming that James Comey was going to refute President Trump's claim that Comey told him 3 different times that he was not under investigation? In the end, notwithstanding CNN and ABC insisting that Comey was going to refute those claims, Comey actually confirmed they were true. How about when Brian Ross at ABC reported that candidate Trump had directed General Flynn to contact the Russians? That news was so significant that the stock market fell when it was released. What ended up being the case? It wasn't candidate Trump who reportedly asked General Flynn to contact the Russians regarding fighting ISIS, for example, but rather President-elect Trump, which is a very different matter. That screw-up, by the way, resulted in Brian Ross being suspended. Those are some pretty significant stories, and in every case, the media was wrong. Now think about the fact that there are 77 more of them in the list at SherylAttkisson.com. Exactly how long is that list going to be by the time the Donald Trump presidency ends? At the rate the media is going, and given that I think he's going to win re-election, it'll be well into the hundreds. Next topic. Guatemala win. Did you see what happened with Guatemala this week? The countries agreed with the United States to adopt a policy requiring persons who are seeking asylum in the U.S. and who travel through Guatemala must apply for asylum in Guatemala. And if they don't and instead move on to the U.S., presumably flooding the border, they will not be able to seek asylum in the U.S. and will instead be subject to return to Guatemala. There are questions about whether it can be enforced because the Guatemalan Assembly is not in session and has not approved it, even though it was signed by the president of Guatemala. Immigration activists have objected because they don't believe Guatemala is a safe country for housing immigrants. But many of those same immigration activists are the ones complaining about the conditions at the border facilities in the U.S. The Trump administration is trying to stem the flow of this massive number of illegal immigrants trying to cross the border. Before this agreement was signed, it appeared that it wouldn't happen because the Guatemalan Supreme Court had ruled that General Assembly approval was required. This latest agreement is somewhat different from the one which the Guatemalan Supreme Court considered. Whether those differences will be enough to produce a different result in a Guatemalan court challenge remains to be seen. But what I want to comment on is how the deal was done. When the president of Guatemala backed away from it just a couple of weeks ago, what did Trump do? He threatened to put tariffs on Guatemala. What was the result? The president of Guatemala signed the agreement. Now, we can all talk about forcing immigrants to stay in Guatemala to apply for asylum and say that it's cruel. But the bottom line is that our southern border is being overwhelmed. Everyone knows that. You can't have an endless parade of complaints from Democrats in Congress about horrible conditions in border facilities because of overcrowding and not acknowledge that we don't have the facilities to handle the flow. We have to get control of the border. And with this one small agreement, President Trump is taking one more incremental step towards gaining that control. And the way that he got there was through tough negotiation. Whether you believe that his predecessors were unwilling to engage in such tough negotiations because they just didn't understand how to do so, or because they really weren't inclined to get control of the border, either way, it seems like on a daily basis this president is teaching how to achieve results by being willing to push, to play hardball, to show that you're willing to make the tough decisions at the risk of being savaged by the opposition party, the media, and some in your own party. Will he ever get credit in the media for those successes? Not likely. Will he get credit from the electorate? I think he will. Next topic. Once Upon a Time in an Overrated Movie. I'm going to close with a short, non-political subject. It's a brief commentary on a movie rather than a full review, so there's no need for a spoiler alert. I won't be revealing any spoilers here. I'm just going to say that sometimes I forget what I've said in my own podcast. In the very first episode of this podcast, I noted that movie critics tend to overrate films about old-time or historical Hollywood or Los Angeles. The examples I gave were L.A. Confidential, the neo-noir crime drama set in early 1950s L.A., which was hailed by critics and received 2 Oscars, even though it was simply a good but not a great film. And Hail Caesar, the Coen brothers comedy which was likewise set in the early 1950s and focused on the Hollywood film industry. Hail Caesar was given generally quite positive reviews, even though I consider it to be one of the worst movies I've ever seen. The explanation I gave for the overrating of both movies by critics was that they all secretly long to be old-time Hollywood directors, or they're simply obsessed with the history of Hollywood and Los Angeles because of their love of film, and that obsession colors their reviews and prevents them from seeing weaknesses in those films. With that background, when I decided to go see the new Quentin Tarantino film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, knowing that it was about 1969 Los Angeles and the film industry, and knowing that it was certified fresh by Rotten Tomatoes with an 85% critic score, I should have had low expectations, because I should have understood that it would be overrated. Not only did I fail to follow my own cautionary notes from episode 1, but I've commented in other episodes about the fact that the site CinemaScore, which polls moviegoers attending the opening nights of films rather than critics, is a more reliable site in my opinion, provided you take into account 2 things. The rankings given are on a scale of A through F. The site is polling on opening night, so it'll be polling the most avid fans of the particular film genre or series if the film is part of a series. Therefore, 1, you must understand that the ratings are likely to be high. Therefore, if a film gets a rating of a B-, it's likely not worth seeing. And to get into the range of C or below, it's probably god-awful. And 2, if the film is of a type that you don't typically like, it's probably not a good idea to rely on CinemaScore, because you're not the type of person that would be attending the film on opening night. Therefore, the people being polled probably won't rate the film the way that you would. So what did I find when I checked CinemaScore before I went to the movie? Well, I didn't check. Once again, I didn't listen to my own advice. Why? Probably because I just couldn't resist a Quentin Tarantino movie starring an actor pairing of Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt. I hadn't heard that the film stunk, and once I saw an 85% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, that was good enough for me, given that I just wanted to see the film. So there you go. So how was it? The first act was unbelievably boring. The second act picked it up a bit. I won't reveal how because I said there'd be no spoilers. The third act was what you expect from Quentin Tarantino, and it saved the film. If it had continued at the pace of the first 2 acts, I would have left more disappointed than after just about any movie I've ever seen. But it didn't because of the third act. Can I recommend it? Not at full price. For a matinee? Probably. But be darn sure you take some no-dos or drink a lot of caffeinated cola or coffee to get you through the first 2 hours of this overly long 2-hour and 45-minute movie. I will say one more thing that this film absolutely established. For anyone wondering whether the more charismatic film actor is Leonardo DiCaprio or Brad Pitt, the answer is absolutely crystal clear. It's Brad Pitt, hands down. As I noted, the third act saved this film. And up until that third act, almost every single enjoyable moment in the film centered on Brad Pitt or his interaction with a secondary character. He carried this movie. Hopefully, I've done a good enough job of carrying this podcast to you each week. I'll be back next week with another episode of Political Spirits, so please join me and tell your friends about Political Spirits, and follow me on Twitter at Franklin Rye. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.